So we're continuing with Chapter 9, Section 4, and we got down through the War of 1812 to the last battle of that war, which is the Battle of New Orleans. We already went over the section of the British coming down through Canada, the burning down of Washington, D.C., and now the British have decided to come to a less defended area of the Gulf, coming down through the Gulf of Mexico. First of all, they wanted to set up a fort in Pensacola here, and then on to overcoming New Orleans and taking that part, the Louisiana Purchase, from America. We talked about Andrew Jackson, so let's begin and discuss this fight here, the fight that would end up in victory. Andrew Jackson, who was Andrew Jackson? He lived 1767 to 1845. He was a tough frontiersman, and he was put in charge of the volunteers during the War of 1812. So volunteers. So his group of officers were actually volunteers. In 1814, he defeated the Creek Indians in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in the Mississippi Territory, so he was a rough Indian fighter. He then drove the British out of Pensacola in West Florida, kind of about where we live down here. And they were trying to establish a military base at Pensacola, and he overcame that British military base. The British then threatened the whole Gulf Coast. But Jackson was ready, and he was determined. He experienced respect as the commander of his men. His men loved him. In fact, they called him Old Hickory, and that Old Hickory was a formidable foe indeed. He was a great leader of his and commander of his men. Here's some pictures. The Battle of New Orleans has a picture there of Andrew Jackson leading them. Here's a statue that's been commemorated for Andrew Jackson. And of course, he is on our $20 bill. Bet you didn't know that. You should. You have $20. But anyway, the Battle of New Orleans victory. So in 1814, it started to draw to a close. So this has been 2 years of battling under the Battle of 1812, and now it's 1814. Jackson headed for New Orleans to defend it against the oncoming fleet. So America knew there's a fleet coming to New Orleans. And so his army consisted of just tough frontiersmen, tough guys. And then he was joined by a band of pirates. You think of New Orleans, you think of French, don't you? Well, French pirates under Jean Lafitte. Jean Lafitte lived 1780 to 1825. Here's a picture of him. He decided to join America and fight against the British coming over and taking over New Orleans. And so they had the Mississippi on one side, and then they had the swamps on the other side, and a wall of cotton bales in front to defend them. They were ready for the British to come. And so as the British were coming into New Orleans, we'll see the Battle of New Orleans, and you'll see this picture. This actually is a stamp of the Battle of New Orleans. Basically, the frontiersmen were sharpshooters, a lot of sharpshooters. They had been hunting all kinds of stuff. They were young men, and they could aim and shoot pretty well, and they were ready for the British. This was the most heroic battle, especially of 1812. On June 8th, 1815, the British general, his name was Pakenham, and he made an all-out frontal attack. So the British are coming out, all-out attack, thinking, no big deal. He assumed his 5,300 troops were highly trained redcoats, and they were soldiers. And of course, he thought, we're going to intimidate those 4,500 American volunteers. Well, they'll just flee when they see us coming. No big deal. He didn't really know what kind of volunteers that Andrew Jackson had. Sharpshooters and rough frontiersmen. Instead, they stood their ground against the British. The artillery fire took down many of the redcoats before they even could get close to Jackson's battlement. Jackson's riflemen were sharpshooters from Kentucky and Tennessee. They totally devastated the British. In a half an hour time, just in 1/2 hour, 2,100 British troops were dead or wounded, including the General Pakenham. Pakenham was dead, and the British troops were practically, now we have 5,000 of them, but almost half of them were dead. Here's the outcome written here. The British here, they said, had 2,332 casualties in the end. And the wounded, you'll see the wounded and the captured, they had 584 captured. And 3 of the major British generals were dead, including the head general, Pakenham. The United States only had 314 casualties compared to all those. Only 37 Americans were killed compared to 2,100 or 2,300 or to 432 one and on to. So we only had, and we had 104 captured. So much less than the British, of course. It looks to me the most heroic battle was a complete victory. But the British had already surrendered, but the British soldiers didn't know, and neither did the frontiersmen. Ironically, the Battle of New Orleans did not have to be fought if the message had got there on time. Of course it didn't. The day before Christmas, while Jackson erected his battlefront, the British had signed a peace treaty. But the news hadn't reached America until after the battle. The British troops did not even know themselves. So they were going to attack anyway. The battle was going to go on anyway. The communication back there, of course, was very slow. We didn't have a telephone. We didn't have email, So basically, they didn't know that the British were already talking about surrendering. In fact, they already had. Then what was going up in Massachusetts? They didn't know either. So in Massachusetts, many New Englanders, not only Massachusetts, but also the other parts of New England, Massachusetts and Connecticut for sure, had opposed the war from the beginning, basically thinking, oh, this war has to be on the impressment of sailors. We could see, is there any way we can talk to them about this and work this thing out? Well, so they didn't really agree with Madison's decision in the beginning. In the late 1814, Massachusetts was tired of this war, and so they called the other states to send delegates to discuss the course of the war. That's why I say this war was controversial. The convention of the Federal delegates met in Hartford, Connecticut. So they went to Hartford, Connecticut to meet, to say, we do not want to be part of this war anymore. The convention echoed the Kentucky Resolution. Remember Kentucky Resolution, when Kentucky said, well, we're not going to go with the federal government on this decision. So they did not want to go with the federal government on the decision of war. And so they thought that we could have the right to nullify this act of Congress declaring war. However, no steps were taken to actually do this. Why? Basically, because the national problems were totally avoided because the war had already ended. So the war ended before that they could stand up, the states could stand up and say, nope, we're going to succeed from this and not be part of the Union in this war. So you can see if the war had gone on, we would have had lots of problems, almost a civil war going on between the New England states and the South. A treaty ends the war. So basically, both sides were growing weary. You can imagine the British were growing weary. They were already fighting a war with Napoleon, for goodness sakes. And basically, and the Americans, hoping, fighting and defending their own country was hard, and hoping and praying that the war would come forth as a victory, which it had been doing. Great Britain had heavy debts fighting France and America both. And the United States didn't really make a whole lot of progress in the midst. So the British blockade of commerce damaged our economy. Remember, the British blockaded our commerce, and so did France. And we had basically went through all of those different acts from the Embargo Act, that was one of the dumbest acts that Thomas Jefferson did before Madison came in. And so basically that now our economy had been damaged, so we actually were tired. Basically, the American and the British were tired. And here's a picture of the Treaty of Ghent, where they got together to make peace with Great Britain. The Treaty of Ghent is in Belgium. So in the summer of 1814, the United States sent a delegation to Ghent. This delegation included John Quincy Adams, which later would become a president of the United States, and Albert Gallatin, Henry Clay, which was one of our war hawks, James Bayard, and Jonathan Russell to meet the British officials in Ghent, Belgium. That was that picture I showed you. Here's another picture, little picture, but I showed you that bigger picture of Ghent. And after several months of negotiation, they signed the treaty. On December 24th, the day before Christmas, 1814, the war would end. That little over 2 years. Essentially, they would have just a ceasefire because neither side really gained or lost any territory at all. And they just agreed to stop fighting. And nothing was said about the impressment of American seamen or the violation of neutral rights. These were the important why we had the war, because they were impressing and kidnapping our seamen and also violating our neutral rights. But since Britain wasn't at war anymore with France, they weren't doing that anymore. So all of this didn't apply. So it was really a time for America and Great Britain to sit down for a ceasefire and have a peace treaty. The Americans did have benefits of the War of 1812. What do you think they were? Well, by taking a stand against the ruler of the seas, Great Britain, America enjoyed the respect of foreign nations as a power to be reckoned with. As America stood up, all of the countries, of the world and Europe, the European countries, I should say, looked to America and said, wow, these guys are patriotic. These guys will stand up, for their seamen, basically stand up for their ships and their sailors, right? So the war was stimulated American industry, and all trade that had been halted by British blockades continued. And so now, before the trade continued again, Americans had started to produce their own products now. They didn't need British products so much. They realized they couldn't depend on Great Britain. And so that was a good benefit, that now Americans were standing up, and it stimulated American industry. It also created a new spirit of patriotism, a new pride in the country that all Americans were determined to make and build a better America. It stimulated Western expansion now, crushing these Native American confederacies and hostilities with the Native Americans in the territory between the Appalachians and Mississippi River there. They could now settle. Americans could go west. They could go expand. Settlers could come into the western areas and not be so afraid, since the Native American terrorist tribes had been put down, right? So the consequences of the war, number one, I would say, was increasing patriotism. There were many heroes from the War of 1812 and heroines. And it broke the streak of the Native Americans toward the government of the United States, and America was expanded with more manufacturing, and America proved it could defend itself in a major world war. So the war of our major world power, I should say, not major world war, the War of 1812. President Madison. So what do I think about President Madison? President Madison was a framer. They call him the father of the Constitution. He was very, very intelligent, and he was very, very patriotic. He was the father of Thomas Jefferson on state, to state rights over federal rights. He wasn't a Federalist, yet he stood behind some of the major Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton. So when I look at James Madison, I know that he was a great American president. So, in fact, some of the things that he wrote here. So he wrote, "Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." So basically he was saying, we must not be silent. And he had declared war, and as a hero to stand up against what Great Britain was doing to our people. So on to some of these other things he said. James Madison reminded Americans the important and responsibility which fall on nations blessed with freedom. So he wrote many things, and many things that he wrote we have now, and we look back and think, wow, he surely was an important statesman, an important president. The citizens of the United States are responsible for the greatest trust confided to a political society. If justice, good faith, honor, gratitude, and qualities which ennoble character of our nation and fulfill ends of government be the fruits of our establishments, the cause of liberty will acquire a dignity and luster which it has never yet enjoyed. An example will be set which cannot have the most favorable influence on the rights of mankind. Basically, he's saying, if we stand for justice, if we stand for good faith and honor and gratitude, and if we are noble in our character, then our fruits, the fruits of our establishment will flourish, and our freedom, our liberty will acquire dignity and luster. It will shine. Our liberty, our freedom will shine throughout the world. What a great thing. And this example will be set all over on the rights of mankind. He's saying, if we stand up and do right, we as a country will shine. If, on the other hand, he said, our government should be unfortunately blotted with the reverse of these things, bad things, and we don't have integrity of these cardinal and essential virtues, if we don't have these virtues, the great cause would be dishonored and betrayed. So saying, if we don't stand for these virtues, we will be dishonored and betrayed. The last thing he said, the last and fairest experiment in favor of the rights of human nature will be turned against them, and their patrons and friends exposed to be insulted and silenced by the votaries of tyranny and usurpation. So what he's saying there is basically, if we do not stand for righteousness, if we do not stand for the things of God, the Bible, biblical principles, which James Madison knew, then we would end up a country that has lost favor, and the rights of human nature will be turned against us. And we will actually be insulted and silenced by tyranny and despot and those dictators rather than a free nation. Absolutely right. So when you think about James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, we can say, well done, thy good and faithful servant. He did what he could do. And I especially like his wife, Dolly, She was the hostess. And in fact, have you heard of Dolly Madison pastries and Dolly Madison cookies and such? Because she definitely, for all those years, through Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, which we can think of, over 16 years, she basically was the hostess in the White House of the United States of America. And she was a hero, and a heroine in the midst of a crisis during the War of 1812. So let's now, this is actually the end of your 9 weeks and you can take your test. I have a couple little things I'm going to go over before you take your test and put them on a video. I didn't go over some of the little usurps that you have in your book. So do that and then you can go ahead and take your tests. 3 tests. I hope you've taken a couple of them already.